Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth Series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, December 22nd. Our guest today is Scott Giles, who's the president and CEO of VSAC, or the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation. They've recently released a study that examines post-secondary enrollment and completion patterns among Vermont students at two-year schools. This follow-up study of the Vermont high school class of 2012 examines such themes as preparedness for college, full-time versus part-time enrollment, and barriers to degree completion. The study also identifies some significant areas of opportunity for future investment, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're pleased to have Mr. Giles with us today. So I just kind of get us started here about the special report. I guess I wondered if you could describe, sort of in a nutshell, what does the report reveal or tell us about, Vermont's post-secondary students or enrollment and completion patterns at two-year and four-year colleges? It seems like the numbers are surprising. I don't know, the number, particularly the two-year colleges, that it takes longer than 2 years for a lot of people to get through them.
Yeah, and part of that is because, so many of the students that are attending those institutions, are individuals who are out of high school for a number of years, they're working, and they may be just supporting themselves, they may be supporting a family, so they tend to be going part-time, and balancing work life, family life, and, their education all at the same time, which we know that any two of those things can be really complicated, and the students that we are looking at, we in this report looked mainly at students that were coming straight out of high school, but we're aware that all of these students are balancing, those three elements of their lives, and it's very common for them to take, as you mentioned, 3 years or maybe 4 years to get a two-year degree. Because they're taking one or two courses a semester, maybe year-round, as their time permits.
What will you be using this report and the study for? I mean, are you going to be presenting this to the legislature and saying, hey, we ought to do something about this, or what's the next step?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the purpose of this report and its predecessor, which looked at students that went to four-year schools, is to help us understand what Vermont students are experiencing, identify the barriers to success that they may be facing so that we can partner with Vermont institutions of higher education, whether it's the Community College of Vermont or Vermont Technical College, to remove those barriers or develop strategies for better supporting the students. It's been interesting. Education remains one of the most important investments that students are going to make. And when I say education, I mean training as well. I'm not thinking necessarily just a 2 or a 4-year degree. But what we've seen during the pandemic, much like the last recession, was that the more education or training you have, the more resilient you are when there's a downturn. We're seeing that now. Our hope is to be able to go to the legislature to be able to shed more light on how students who attend two-year programs are faring, identify the financial challenges they're facing. We call out some of the academic challenges they're facing, and then work together to develop policies that provide them, better support, so that we can guarantee that they don't just start those education pathways, but they actually get the degree or certificate they need to get the advantage of it in the workplace.
As an organization that helps students get financial support and get financial aid, I mean, how big of a piece is that? I mean, my guess would be that particularly for students who may be the first in their families to be going to college, finding that kind of financial support to kind of pay those bills is a pretty big deal. And does that kind of explain a lot of the reasons why, some of them don't graduate until much longer than they might have originally hoped?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two things that are going on. One is, we talk a lot about how expensive education is, And when we talk about that, people hear it in different ways. And we oftentimes don't talk about the financial aid that would be available to help them. I'll give a concrete example in a minute of that. And then for many of these students, because they are working to support themselves at the same time, they're going to school part-time, they may be working 3/4 to full-time, and even small things that might happen along the way can derail them in some way. You can imagine that if you are going to the community college or VTC, commuting back and forth to school, because these are non-residential programs by and large, something as simple as your car breaking down, an unexpected bill like that may mean that you can't drive to school for a week while you come up with the money from your next paycheck to be able to pay for it. And unless you are a stellar student, missing a week of school can make all the difference between whether you can succeed or not. So as a result of what it is that we learned from this report, we at VSAC last year worked with the legislature to develop some new programs to try and provide additional financial aid. On the starting side, we were able to increase our grant funding so that if you were a student coming from a family making less than $30,000, between our grant and the federal Pell Grant, you can actually go to CCV nearly tuition free. So the money that you would have to earn from a job would be to cover those living expenses and not incidental book expenses and things of that nature. And then we actually developed an emergency microgrant that's a $400 to $500 grant that is designed for emergencies. And we work with the schools, pretty much put out word that if one of your students comes to you and says, I don't know what I'm going to do, an emergency medical bill, an emergency car bill, could be a utility bill, something that they weren't planning on that is about to derail them, we set aside some money so that we can provide them that one-time emergency grant. And many times we can get that money in their hands in 48 hours to prevent them from missing school.
One of the data points I've run across frequently, and it may have changed since the last time I've seen it, was that Vermont seems to have a very high, relative to the rest of the country, level of high school graduation. But a relatively low or a lower one of kids going on to college from there. Is that still the case as best you can determine, and why is that so? Do you think? I mean, you would think that if students get through high school, then more than I think was around 50% roughly is how many kids go on to college, but. Is that typical for most states, or where do we stand?
Yeah, so each year or every 2 years, we track these numbers, and the most recent year that we have, it's about 58% go on, which would put us in the kind of lower middle part of the national average. What we see when we look more deeply in the data, it breaks down very, very significantly by generational status. And when we say generational status, if your parents have a college degree, you have a 75 to 80% likelihood that you're going to go on to some form of post-secondary education. Where things really break down, it's for those students whose families don't have any experience or exposure to education of any kind. And in particular, we're seeing young first-generation boys. They are graduating from high school. Many of them didn't have great educational experiences when they were in school. And, based on what they see around them, they believe that they're going to be able to earn, a decent living without education or training. And we're increasingly finding, is not surprisingly, 4 or 5 years out, they're discovering that you can't earn enough money to do the things you want to do unless you pursue something else. So, your point is a great one because we as a state need to do more to provide support, in particular to those two groups.
And sort of ancillary to that, course, one of the big points of discussion in recent years has been college loan debt and people who graduate from college with these astonishing numbers, amount of debt. And I'm sure there are probably a lot of kids who are sort of iffy about college in the first place, and they go, well, what do I want to like take on 50, 60, 70, $80,000 worth of debt for when I can go out, get a job, and start making money right away? How does the whole college loan debt image factor into all of this? I mean, are people like so spooked by that particularly now this year, just saying, I'll take a gap year and think about it?
I think it plays out, much along the lines that you think it would. So the student loan challenges are real, but they're not experienced by everybody. And the average, when we take a look at our grant recipients, which are lower middle and lower income students, the average debt for a 4-year degree is about $31,000, for them. And averages can be misleading because there are students with none, and then there are students with substantially more than that. And I would argue, that's probably a pretty darn good investment, for most students to make. But there's no doubt that when people hear stories of individuals that have borrowed $60,000 or $70,000, for an education, most of whom, when we look into it, turn out to be graduate students and professional students who are the students with the fastest growing student loan debt, and now are the students that are the most vocal about their student loan debt. Students coming from families that have experience managing debt and, have the support from their parents to make good, smart choices about where they go to school, I think are continuing to go on, and we see those numbers showing up in their continuation rates. But there's no doubt that if you're a student coming from a family for whom all of this is new, and you hear these stories, as well as stories about the struggles that recent college graduates have had getting jobs in the midst of this pandemic, you step back and ask yourself whether this is a risk you really want to take.
So I was wondering, your study looks at the class of 2012, if I've understood it correctly. I guess I just wondered, is there any reason to think that if you had done a comparable study of, let's say, the class of 2016, who would be graduating this year, would have graduated, would some of the numbers around students were able to complete their curriculum within the 2 or 4 year period be different, or do you figure that the numbers haven't really changed all that much?
So these numbers have been pretty stable. And the reason that we looked at the class of 2012 was it allowed us to look over a 7-year window to see how they actually performed. We are actually going to do a similar study for the class of 2018. We've been doing the senior survey now for over 40 years, and we've got the data that we have accumulated through that. And to just test the very question that you asked us, we went back to look at some historic data on continuation rates to see whether it was stable. And what we saw when we looked back was that the numbers looked very similar if we looked back 5 or 10 years earlier.
So, talking about the state colleges here, it's been a rough year for a lot of them, and it sounds like they're all under a lot of financial pressure. How does that impact or play out in the minds of kids who are thinking about going to, let's say, Castleton or Northern Vermont University or Vermont Tech? The fact that they seem to be needing bridge funding to kind of just tide the things over, or maybe even have further mergers in some way or another. Does that, do people hearing that go, well, I guess I won't? I mean, does that that must be having some sort of negative impact, I would think.
Absolutely does. If you're a student and you picked a school that you're very interested in, whether it's a 2-year or a 4-year program, mainly in this context of this conversation, it's about the 4-year institutions. And you're imagining what your life is going to be for the next 4 years. And if you hear news that makes it sound as though that institution is not stable, most students start to think about, pursuing their educations, or at least starting their educations in different places. What we're all hoping from this, though, as much as the state colleges are facing some challenges, this conversation is opening or shedding the light on the possibility of some real opportunities. And, I've had the privilege of working on a legislatively established task force to look at the future of public higher education. And while we've got a long way to go, the conversation, particularly about unifying programs across the system, which is different from closing a campus or closing things, invites us to imagine what it would be like if you were a student that wanted to take a course, a student at Northern Vermont University who wanted to take a course that's not available this semester on your campus, but is available at Castleton or at Linden. A unified system in which I had access to all of the course offerings at every institution, every semester and every year, and could easily and seamlessly chart that path, could create a tremendous value proposition for students that they've never had before. And so I'm hoping that as we work our way through this, we'll be able to help them navigate some of the operational and financial challenges. And there's no doubt that will take, a real investment. But success won't be measured simply by whether we've stabilized them financially. It'll be measured by whether or not from this work we've created a new institution that creates a brand new value proposition and new opportunity for students across the state. I'm hopeful, based on the conversations I've had with the chancellor and with the other members of the task force, that opportunity really lies in front of us.
And what's been your sense or takeaway from the impact of the whole COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, on the one hand, we've had a lot of uncertainty in hybrid learning and remote learning and all of that, and people feeling like they're not really getting their money's worth because they're not being able to live on campus like they normally would, and so forth and so on. Although I've been finding myself wondering if there's also a flip side to all of that, and this is a real opportunity to rethink a lot of stuff. Like you were just saying there, the student, for instance, whose car breaks down, why couldn't that student then go on a Zoom call and kind of just stay up to speed, or even that would be a normal way of doing it. They could live at home, have a job, and tune into their class at 2:00 in the morning if that's the way it worked. I've been wondering if there's any thought given to saying, okay, so now we see how remote learning can or cannot work. Is this worth exploring a little bit further?
One of the silver linings of the pandemic has been exactly that we've all discovered, probably having believed that we couldn't, that we can do things differently. And one of the, lasting questions for all of us is going to be, how do we take the things that worked really well for us now and keep them, once we're able to return back to the new normal? I think hybrid learning is going to be with us in some, kind of shape or form, forever, in part for the reasons we just described, that it creates opportunities for some students, particularly in remote areas. The other thing that we've learned at the residential campuses, and you've alluded to this by the family reactions to remote learning, for those people who thought this would bring on a permanent shift to, fully permanent online learning, we've discovered that there's a strong, market for a traditional residential experience that's augmented by some form of, hybrid remote learning. I think that's going to be with us, forever, and creates opportunities for students to be able to have the social elements and the in-person elements that they value, while being able to access resources that were never before available. I think about our own work at VSAC. I like to tell the story of one of our counselors who lives and works up in the Northeast Kingdom. She's one of our most gifted counselors, working with veterans. And wonderful, wonderful resource for the veterans up in the kingdom and then further down the White River area. Technology, most of her work was done in person, and one of the younger, more technologically comfortable adult outreach counselors in the southern part of the state reached out to her and said, would you do a Zoom room with me to talk to veterans? And they did a minimal advertising, and they had 100 veterans from around the state, kind of call into this. And it was an aha moment for us that this wonderful resource that was available up in the Northeast Kingdom, through this technology, was now available to veterans, whether they lived, in Manchester or Bennington, Brattleboro, or in Worcester. And I think every institution is discovering some version of the same thing, and that will be with us, forever.
Just one final question. It just occurred to me as we were talking. Do you have any numbers, like either in the study or elsewhere, that show the number of students who go to the state colleges in Vermont who then graduate and then stay in Vermont, as opposed to moving someplace else? I mean, I know that's been a big topic of conversation around the whole demographic challenges the state's facing, and not enough young people staying here, or the jobs that they want are in cities. And of course, that brings up the whole point of, we've seen a lot of people moving here as well in the course of the pandemic. So within the whole remote working thing, making that possible. But I guess I just wondered, is there any trend that you've been able to ascertain that says, well, a lot of these students do in fact stay in Vermont after they graduate, and kind of bring these skills to benefit the state's economy?
One of the things intuitively we all know is the more education you have, the more mobile you are, because opportunities and interests are pretty significantly expanded. If you look at programs like at VTC, the 2-year programs, and or at CCV, the programs that provide education and training predominantly to adults, the vast majority of those students will get their credential and remain working here in Vermont. And we find, probably, when I talk to the state colleges, they'll talk about 65 or 70% of all their students, remaining in the state. What's really interesting, though, to think about from a demographic perspective, and something that, I talk about all the time, Vermont imports on a per capita basis more students than any other region in the country but the District of Columbia. And so at any given point in time, and you think about Vermont's, private colleges, from the, Bennington, to Middlebury, our public institutions as well, thinking about the University of Vermont, the Vermont State Colleges. At any given period of time, there are some 20,000 non-Vermonters attending a Vermont college or university. And I have often argued, and we're making some progress in this regard, that one key way that we can change the demographic trends that we've been talking about is to do a better job of connecting those students as well to the economic opportunities that exist within the state.
Wow. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. Hopefully we keep them here and grow the economy, or whatever it is we need to do. Well, Mr. Giles, thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Be well and be safe.
All right. You too. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for your time as well, for being with us. And best for a happy holiday season. And we'll see you in the new year. Take care.